Diana Parker was 28 years old, 3 months pregnant, and standing in the middle of what should have been the happiest night of her life. It was her first wedding anniversary, surrounded by family, lights, and a room full of people pretending everything was perfect. And for a brief moment, she almost believed it was. Then the door opened. A man no one recognized walked straight into the room, didn't greet anyone, didn't hesitate. He stopped, looked directly at her, and pointed. "The baby she's carrying," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "is mine." The room went silent. At first, no one reacted, like they were waiting for someone to laugh it off, to call it a joke. But he didn't smile. He didn't back down. Instead, he reached into his bag and pulled out documents, medical reports, dates, details, everything lined up too perfectly. Then came the photos. People leaned in, whispers spread, and within seconds, the entire mood shifted. The same family that had been smiling at her moments ago started looking at her like they had just discovered something disgusting. She tried to speak, but her voice didn't matter anymore. Because in that moment, it wasn't just a stranger accusing her. It was an entire room deciding she was guilty. And what happened next, no one in that house was prepared for. Before we get into the full story, tell me, what time is it where you are right now, and what city are you watching from? I want to see how far the story can reach. And if you enjoy real stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments. A few hours earlier, the night had felt completely different. Diana stood near the edge of the room, her hand resting lightly over her stomach, trying to stay calm while voices moved around her and controlled, polite tones that never quite reached warmth. This was not unfamiliar to her. It was the same quiet distance she had been feeling ever since she stepped into her husband's world, a place where everything looked perfect on the surface, but never truly opened its doors to her. His family had never needed to say anything directly. It was always in the way conversations paused when she joined, in the way eyes lingered just a second too long before looking away, in the subtle comments that sounded harmless but carried weight. She had learned to recognize it, to endure it, and to pretend it didn't matter. Because for her, this marriage was not just about love. It was about finally belonging somewhere after years of having nowhere to return to. Long before she met him, Diana had already learned what it felt like to be unwanted. Growing up, she had always been the one who came second, the one compared, the one overlooked. Her parents never hid their preference. Her older sister was the one they invested in, the one they praised, the one they believed would carry the family forward. Diana, on the other hand, was treated like an afterthought, someone expected to adapt, to give in, to accept less without complaint. Over time, the distance became something heavier, something that could no longer be ignored or explained away. 5 years ago, she made a choice that changed everything. She left. No dramatic goodbye, no attempt to fix what had already been broken beyond repair. She simply walked away and never looked back. And from that moment on, her family treated her as if she no longer existed. No calls, no messages, no attempt to reach out. It was as if she had been erased. That silence followed her into every part of her life, shaping the way she saw people, shaping the way she held on to anything that felt even slightly like stability. So when she married into a family that had everything she had never had, she tried harder than she ever should have. She adjusted the way she spoke, the way she dressed, the way she reacted to things that hurt more than she allowed herself to admit. Not because she wanted their approval, but because she was afraid of losing the one person who had chosen her without hesitation. And that fear stayed with her, even on a night that was meant to celebrate something strong. It sat quietly beneath her smile, beneath every polite conversation, waiting for a moment she didn't see coming. Then the room shifted without warning. The man didn't wait for anyone to question him or ask who he was. He stepped forward with a level of confidence that didn't match the tension spreading across the space, his eyes fixed entirely on Diana as if nothing else existed around him. When she tried to speak again, her words came out unsteady, barely forming before he cut across them with something sharper, something louder, something that carried enough certainty to pull every bit of attention toward him. He repeated his claim, slower this time, making sure every single person in the room heard it clearly. Then reached into his bag and placed a stack of papers onto the table in front of him. No one stopped him. No one told him to leave. The silence had already turned into something else, something heavier, something that was waiting to be filled. One of the relatives moved first, picking up the documents with hesitant hands, scanning through them quickly before passing them along to someone else. It spread fast after that. The papers moved from one person to another, and with each exchange, the expressions in the room began to change. Confusion turned into suspicion, and suspicion hardened into judgment. Someone whispered that the timeline matched. Another voice pointed out specific details that seemed too precise to ignore. The more they looked, the more convinced they became, not because they fully understood what they were seeing, but because it looked real enough to believe. Diana stood there, frozen in place, trying to understand how something like this could exist, how her name, her life, could be twisted into something she had never lived. When she tried to deny it again, her voice was drowned out by the rising noise around her, a mix of murmurs, accusations, and quiet conclusions forming faster than she could respond. Then his mother stepped forward. There was no hesitation in her movement, no doubt in her expression. Her hand struck Diana across the face with a force that cut through every other sound in the room, leaving behind a silence that felt even sharper than before. The words that followed were colder than the impact, each one delivered with a certainty that made it clear she had already decided what to believe. She didn't ask questions. She didn't wait for an explanation. She spoke as if the truth had already been confirmed, as if everything about Diana had finally been exposed. Other voices joined in after that, not loud at first, but steady, repeating the same ideas in different ways, building a wall of judgment that closed in from every direction. Someone mentioned her background. Someone else said they had always suspected something was wrong. It didn't take long before the focus shifted from the accusation itself to what it meant for the family, for their name, for the image they had carefully maintained. Diana felt the shift happen in real time, the way the room stopped seeing her as a person and started seeing her as a problem that needed to be removed. She turned toward her husband, searching for something that could hold the situation together, something that could stop everything from collapsing further. But before he could say a single word, the pressure around them had already reached a point where silence was no longer an option. For a brief moment, no one moved. The tension in the room tightened into something almost visible, pressing down on everyone as if the air itself had grown heavier. Her husband stood still at first, his expression unreadable, his eyes fixed on the man in front of him with a focus that cut through the noise without needing to raise his voice. Then, without warning, he stepped forward. The movement was quick, decisive, leaving no space for interruption. His hand closed around the front of the man's shirt, pulling him off balance before shoving him back with enough force to make him stumble. The reaction came too late for anyone to stop it. A sharp impact followed, controlled but unmistakable, sending the man reeling to the side as the room erupted into overlapping voices. It wasn't chaos, not exactly, but it was no longer contained. Her husband didn't look at anyone else. He kept his attention locked on the man, his voice low but firm, carrying a weight that forced the room to quiet down again. He made it clear that whatever had just been said would not be accepted without question, that no stranger could walk into his home and decide the truth of his life. There was no hesitation in the way he spoke, no sign of doubt in the way he stood between Diana and everything else in that room. When he finally turned, it wasn't toward the man. It was toward his family. The shift was immediate, and it changed the entire atmosphere. His mother stepped forward again, but this time her voice was sharper, more controlled, as if she had already calculated the outcome she wanted. She didn't argue about what had happened. She moved straight to what needed to be done. Her words were clear, direct, leaving no room for discussion. End it. Fix this before it spreads further. His father followed, not louder, but colder, his tone carrying the kind of authority that had shaped every decision in that house for years. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He spoke about consequences, about reputation, about everything that could be lost if the situation wasn't handled immediately. Others joined in, not all at once, but enough to build pressure from every direction, reinforcing the same message in different ways. This wasn't about uncertainty anymore. It was about control. Diana felt it shift again, the way the room stopped reacting and started demanding a resolution. She didn't speak. She didn't try to defend herself again. This moment was no longer hers to fight. It belonged to him. For a second, everything slowed. Her husband stood there, surrounded by expectations that had been placed on him long before this night, expectations tied to his name, his position, everything he had been raised to protect. Then he moved again, but this time it wasn't toward the man or toward his family. He walked directly to Diana and took her hand. The gesture was simple, but it carried more weight than anything that had been said. He didn't explain. He didn't justify. He didn't ask for permission. He just held on to her and turned toward the door. Voices rose behind them, calling his name, trying to pull him back, but he didn't slow down. Not even once. He led her out of the room, out of the house, leaving everything else behind without looking back. In the quiet that followed, the noise of that night no longer mattered. The house they stayed in felt smaller, not because of its size, but because of everything that had been left unresolved, sitting between them without needing to be spoken out loud. Diana didn't ask questions at first. She didn't push for answers or demand explanations, even though every part of her wanted to understand how something like that could happen without warning. Instead, she watched him. Her husband didn't try to comfort her with empty reassurance or quick conclusions. He focused on something else entirely, something more deliberate. He began going through every detail from that night, piece by piece, as if the truth could be uncovered by refusing to ignore anything that didn't fit. It started with the documents. He didn't accept them at face value. He looked at the formatting, the signatures, the timing of the reports, searching for inconsistencies that others had overlooked. It didn't take long before something felt off. The information aligned too perfectly, not in a way that proved accuracy, but in a way that suggested it had been arranged to appear convincing. Real records, he explained, rarely followed such clean patterns. That was the first break in the surface. From there, he moved to the photos. At first glance, they seemed undeniable, but when he slowed everything down, details began to shift. Lighting didn't match. Angles felt unnatural. Small elements in the background repeated in ways they shouldn't. It wasn't obvious, not unless someone was looking for it, but once seen, it couldn't be ignored. Diana listened as he pointed these things out, her confusion slowly turning into something sharper, something closer to anger. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. This had been built. That realization changed the weight of everything that had happened. It meant intention. It meant planning. It meant someone had decided to create this, not by accident, but on purpose. The next step came quickly after that. Her husband didn't stop at questioning the evidence. He started tracing where it could have come from, who would have had access to the kind of resources needed to make something like that appear real. That search led him to one name: Stephen Holt. He was a legal advisor who had worked closely with his family for years, someone trusted with sensitive matters, someone who understood how documentation could be constructed and presented without raising immediate suspicion. The connection wasn't obvious at first, but once it appeared, it refused to disappear. Records had passed through channels that pointed back to him, subtle enough to go unnoticed under normal circumstances, but clear enough when examined with intent. Diana felt something inside her shift again, not fear this time, but a growing clarity that made everything harder to deny. This wasn't random. It wasn't a stranger acting alone. The deeper they looked, the more it became clear that the situation had roots that extended far beyond a single accusation, reaching into places she had never expected to question before. When the pressure finally closed in, the man stopped pretending. He had held onto his story long enough to make it believable, repeating the same details with practiced confidence, but once he realized there was no way out, the structure he relied on began to fall apart. Her husband didn't give him room to reshape the narrative or hide behind the same claims again. He pushed for specifics, details that couldn't be memorized or rehearsed, forcing him into places where the story could no longer hold together. The hesitation came first, subtle but enough to be noticed. Then the contradictions followed, small at the beginning, but growing harder to ignore with each answer that failed to align with the last. It didn't take long before silence replaced resistance. The man's posture changed, his confidence fading into something far less controlled, something that made it clear he understood the situation had shifted beyond recovery. When he finally spoke again, it wasn't to defend himself. It was to admit what had been hidden from the beginning. He said he had been paid. The words came out uneven, not because they were complicated, but because they carried consequences he could no longer avoid. He explained that everything had been arranged in advance, from the documents to the images, each piece designed to look convincing enough to withstand immediate doubt. He didn't know Diana. He had never met her before that night. His role had been simple. Walk in, deliver the claim, present the evidence, and leave the rest to unfold on its own. Diana felt the weight of that confession settle in slowly, not as shock, but as confirmation of something she had already begun to suspect. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It had been constructed with purpose. Her husband didn't react immediately. He didn't interrupt or raise his voice. He waited, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make the next question unavoidable. Who arranged it? The man hesitated again, but this time there was no attempt to avoid the answer. He lowered his head and spoke quietly, naming the people involved without looking up. It started with his mother. The decision, he explained, had come from her, driven by a belief that the situation needed to be controlled before it developed into something irreversible. His sister had supported it, not as an afterthought, but as someone who understood exactly what was at stake and what needed to be done to protect it. Together, they had taken the idea further, turning it into something actionable instead of leaving it as concern or disapproval. The involvement of Stephen Holt followed naturally after that. He had been the one who ensured everything would hold up under scrutiny, guiding the process in a way that avoided obvious flaws, making the fabricated details appear consistent enough to pass initial inspection. The plan wasn't rushed. It had been built carefully, step by step, with each part reinforcing the next. The goal was never just to create doubt. It was to force a decision, to place enough pressure in a single moment that there would be no time to question it properly. Diana stood there, listening, not interrupting, not reacting outwardly, but feeling everything shift into a clearer shape than before. What had happened that night was no longer confusing. It was deliberate. It was calculated. And it had come from within the very place that had claimed to define family. A week later, they returned without hesitation. The house looked exactly the same, unchanged from the outside, but everything inside it had already shifted in ways that could not be repaired. When they walked in, the reaction was immediate. His family stood there, watching closely, expecting something entirely different from what they were about to face. There was no tension in her husband's posture this time, no uncertainty in the way he moved. He didn't wait to be questioned or welcomed. He stepped forward and began laying out the truth in a way that left no room for denial. He spoke calmly, but every detail carried weight, each part of the plan exposed in a clear sequence that showed exactly how everything had been constructed. The room that once turned against Diana now stood silent for a different reason. His mother tried to interrupt at first, her voice shifting between defense and justification, but the more she spoke, the more it became clear that she was not denying what had been done, only explaining why she believed it was necessary. His father remained quieter, his expression controlled, but there was no confusion in his reaction. He understood the situation fully, and he understood what it meant. His sister didn't step forward at all. She stayed where she was, her silence saying more than any explanation could have. Diana stood beside her husband, not speaking, not reacting outwardly, but watching everything unfold with a clarity she hadn't felt before. There was no longer any confusion about where she stood or what had been done to her. The truth had already removed that uncertainty. When her husband finished, the room remained still, waiting for something to follow, but instead of continuing the discussion, he made a decision that ended it entirely. He made it clear that nothing in that house belonged to him anymore. Not the name, not the expectations, not the connections that had once defined his place in that family. He wasn't asking for an apology. He wasn't negotiating a way forward. He was removing himself completely. His mother tried to stop him then, not with anger this time, but with something closer to desperation, attempting to reframe everything as a mistake that could still be corrected. His father spoke once more, but even his words lacked the authority they once carried. None of it changed anything. The decision had already been made. They left again, but this time it wasn't driven by shock or pressure. It was final. What followed didn't stay contained within that house. The consequences extended outward, reaching into the parts of their lives that had once given them influence. Questions were raised about how something like this had been arranged, about the role Stephen Holt had played in constructing documents that could not be justified under legal review. His position did not remain untouched. Investigations followed, and with them came consequences that could not be dismissed quietly. The family's reputation, something they had tried to protect at any cost, became the very thing that unraveled under scrutiny. Diana didn't feel satisfaction watching it happen. What she felt was something steadier, something clearer. For the first time, she wasn't trying to prove her place in someone else's world. She was standing in her own, without needing their approval to define it. What she learned from all of it wasn't about revenge or winning. It was about understanding that being chosen once doesn't guarantee you will always be protected, but knowing who stands beside you when everything is at risk will show you exactly where you belong. And sometimes, the only way to keep that truth intact is to walk away without looking back.